my name is Dwayne Poweratz. I'm a Solutions Architect at ORock Technologies. We will be creating an instance using ORock OpenStack GUI. By the end of this video, you will have an instance that you can connect to. To create and access a compute instance, we need a few things. We need an internal network to connect it to, a security group to create firewall rules, a router to route traffic, a volume for our block storage, a floating IP address so that we can access it from the internet, a public SSH key so we can access it, and the instance itself. The first screen we see is the login screen. Enter your domain, username, and password. See your sales representative to get this information. Click Connect to continue. The first thing we see is our friendly overview screen, showing what resources we have used and what is available. The first thing we need to do is create our internal network. An internal network can be thought of as a simple switch or a layer 2 device in the OSI model. So let's open our network and network topology tab. We could use an already created network, but we're going to create one. Click on the Create Network button on the right-hand side of the screen. This will bring up a Create Network window with 3 tabs. We need to give our network a name. The name can be anything. Let's use WordPress. The rest should be left as defaults. The checkbox Enable Admin State tells us we want the network to be active. The checkbox Create Subnet says we want to create a subnet, which we'll do in the next tab. Availability Zone Hints gives us hints where OpenStack should create our DHCP agent. Click Next to take us to the Subnet tab. A subnet is where we create our IP addresses, which is a layer 3 device in the OSI model. We need to give our subnet a name. The name could be anything. We can have multiple subnets on the network, just like you could with a physical switch. Let's enter WordPress-subnet. Next, we need to add a network address. We use IP version 4 addresses. The network address uses Cinder format and defines an IP address range. We could use any IP version 4 address, but best practice is to use a private address range. If you're going to have multiple networks and subnets in your overall configuration, it's best to plan your network schema before you get started. For this demo, we'll only have one. Let's use 192.168.101.0/24. If you don't know what this means, take some time to look up Cinder and IP version 4 private address ranges. The gateway IP is the IP address in our range that we will use for the router. We'll leave this blank and use the default, which is the first IP address in our range. The last checkbox is Disable Gateway. If you do not need or want a router, then you can disable the gateway. Next, we need to give some details about the subnet. Click Next to take us to the Subnet Details tab. We can see the Enable DHCP box is checked. For this demo, we want a DHCP server and we'll define the information the DHCP server needs. For the allocation pool, this is a range the DHCP server will use to assign addresses to instances out of our subnet we previously defined. We can use the entire range or just a few addresses. The format is the first IP address to use, comma, the last IP address to use. Let's use a few addresses. Let's use 100 addresses starting with 101. Next thing to define is our DNS servers that we want to use. For this demo, we will use the already entered addresses. We can use addresses of any DNS server we want. If you don't know what DNS is, take a little time and learn what the service provides. We will leave the host routes box empty. This box is used for routes to other subnets that our router is not able to discover. Click Create to create the network. We see the network on our network topology graph. We can see it is not connected to anything. Since we want to access the internet and connect back to our instance, we need to create a router. Let's do that now. Click Create Router. This brings up a Create a Router window. We need to give the router a name. The name can be anything. Let's call our router WordPress-router. We see the checkbox Enable Admin State. This enables the router when we create it. Next, we need to select an external network to connect the router to. We only have one available, so select External Floating IPs. We will leave the Availability Zone Hints as is. These are hints on whether to create the router. Click Create Router. Back on our network topology screen, we can see the router connected to our external floating IPs network, but not connected to our WordPress network. Let's make that connection now. We can hover over the router and it will show us more information, including a button to add an interface. Let's go to the Router tab and add the interface there. Here we can see our router listed. Let's look at WordPress-router's details by clicking on the hyperlink. Now we see our WordPress-router overview screen. We want to add an interface to our router, so click on the interfaces. You can see there are no interfaces listed. This lists only our internal networks. Let's add an interface. A window comes up asking for information on what interface we want to add. Clicking on the subnet dropdown, we can see and choose WordPress. We can also assign a specific IP address in the IP address box. Click Submit to add the interface. Now let's look at our Network Topology tab. Here we can see the router is connected to the external network as well as our internal network. The next thing that we need to do is to create our volume or add our public SSH key. Order doesn't matter for these two tasks. So let's add our SSH key first. Click on Compute, then Key Pairs. Here we have our key pairs. We can create a new key pair or import a public key. We're going to import a public key. If you wanted to create a new key pair, you could create one here. If you're not familiar with what SSH key pairs are, there is plenty of information on the internet. The key pair is needed to access the instance. The public key will be injected into the block storage when we create the instance. Click on Import Public Key. The window Import Public Key comes up. We need to give the key pair a name. I'm going to call this key pair Dwayne. Now I can choose my public key or I can paste it into the public key box. I'm going to paste it into the box. Click Import Public Key. Now we see the key in our list. Now let's create our volume or base operating system. Click on Volumes, then Volumes. Here we can see information about the volumes or block storage we have. We're going to create a 25 gigabyte volume for our compute instance. Click on Create Volume. A window comes up asking information about our volume. Let's call this volume WordPress volume. We can give the volume a description if we want. I'm going to skip this. Next, there is a volume source dropdown. This is where choose an empty volume or create from an image. We're going to create one from an image. You can see more choices have come up. Let's choose the image we're going to use. There are many to choose from. These are base operating system images that have been uploaded. Let's choose CentOS 7. Next is type. Volume types are how the block storage is encrypted. For this demo, we're going to use the default, which is not encrypted. Next, we need to tell what the size of the volume is. We're going to use a 25 gigabyte volume. Availability zone is used to determine which zone the volume will be in. We'll leave it the default. Group is used to group volumes. We'll leave it as no group. Click Create Volume. At this time, OpenStack is creating a volume based off our CentOS 7 image. Now you can see the WordPress volume in the list. Notice the status is available. Now we want to create our security group for the instance. Click Network, then Security Groups. Security groups are our firewall rules. Click Create Security Group. We need to give it a name. Let's use WordPress Sec Group. Click Create Security Group. We need to manage the rules of the security group to allow SSH connections and HTTP connections. Click on Manage Rules for the WordPress security group. We can see that we're currently allowing any traffic out. We need to add rules for SSH and HTTP. Click Add Rule. Here under the drop-down of Rule, there are many rules that are already defined. We're going to select SSH from the drop-down list. We'll leave description, remote, CIDR, and Ethernet type as defaults. Click Add to add the rule. Let's do the same for HTTP. Now we have all the parts to create our instance. Let's click on Compute, then Instances. This window shows the compute instances that we have and information about them. Let's create our compute instance by clicking on Launch Instance. A window comes up with tabs on the left. Some have asterisks, others do not. The tabs that have asterisks need information to create the instance. The tabs that do not, OpenStack was able to guess the information. Let's give our instance the name of WordPress. We can give it a description. We'll skip this for now. We will also leave availability zone the default. We will leave the count as 1 as we only want to create one instance. Click Next to go to the Source tab. On the Source tab, we see the drop-down of Select Boot Source. We could have created our volume here. We're going to select the volume that we already created. We can also select if we want to delete the volume when we delete the instance. I'm going to say yes for this demo because I don't want the volume to exist if I delete the instance. You may want it to exist if the instance is deleted because you need to increase the compute size. You can see the volume that we created listed below. There's an arrow to the right of the name and information. We're going to click it to add it to our instance. You can see our volume is in the allocated section. Let's go to our next tab of flavor. As you can see, there are many flavors listed. Flavors are virtual machine configurations. The list shows the number of virtual CPUs, RAM, and disk. ORock exclusively uses volumes for its block storage, so the zeros on total disk, root disk, and infra disk can be ignored. For this demo, we're going to select M1 Tiny, which has one virtual CPU and 2 GB of RAM. You may have noticed yellow triangles with a bang on them. This indicates you do not have enough resources available to use these flavors. Contact your sales representative to acquire more resources if needed. If we scroll down, we'll see our next button, which will take us to the Networks tab. Here we see the WordPress network that we created. We need at least one network. If your instance needs to connect to multiple networks, we could add them here. Let's go ahead and add WordPress network by clicking the up arrow. Click Next to go to the network ports. Here we could add network ports that we may have created. We have not created any extra network ports. OpenStack will create a network port for our instance for us. Click Next to go to Security Groups. As we know, security groups are firewall rules. OpenStack handles the firewall rules for inbound and outbound traffic. We could open all traffic to our instance and create our own firewall rules on the instance. It is up to us to decide where we want to handle firewall rules. You can see the default rule has been added for us, which allows all traffic out. We want to use the security group we created. Remove default and add WordPress security group. Click Next to go to Key Pair tab. Key pairs are injected into the operating system when it boots for the first time. This allows you to access the system with SSH. The key pair has been added for us as we only have one. Click Next to go to Configuration. Configuration is an advanced topic. It basically will run a script as root when booting for the first time. There's a lot of information on the internet about this. Let's continue to server groups by clicking Next. Server groups are a way to group instances. We did not define any groups, so we will not add any. Click Next to go to Metadata. Metadata allows us to add information to the instance. We did not define any, so we will not add any. We are now ready to launch our instance. Click Launch Instance to start the creation. We can see our status is build. Once it goes active, it means our instance is up and running. Our instance is now up and running. The last thing we need to do is associate an external IP address to our instance so we can connect to it. On the right-hand side of WordPress, there is a drop-down menu. Click Associate Floating IP. First box of IP address shows there's no floating IP address associated. Let's create one by clicking the plus button. We can select the pool of external addresses that we want to use for the floating IP. Since we only have one, we'll leave it selected. We can add a description if we like. Click Associate IP. This takes us back to the first window. We can see there is an IP address populated in our IP address selection now. We can also see the port that it is associated to. If your instance has more than one network port, we could change it here. Since we only have one, we'll leave it. Click Associate. Looking at the IP address column, we can see the external IP address has been associated. Using our favorite SSH tool, we will connect to the instance. I'm going to connect to my local Ubuntu development box and then try to connect to the instance. We need the external IP address, so let's copy that now. On my local Ubuntu box, I have a command prompt. I have my SSH keys configured on this machine. Let's try and connect to the instance, but we don't know what the username is. How do we find out? It really depends on the operating system and image we used. You can look for this information on the internet. One trick is to try and connect as root. Most of the images will tell you a username other than root to use. Let's SSH to the machine using root and see what happens. You can see it tells us to use the user CentOS rather than root. So let's log on as CentOS. You're now connected to the machine and can make configuration changes as you like. As you probably guessed, I'm going to install WordPress. You can find out information on how to install WordPress on the internet. Let's go and check out our WordPress instance. Success! We have WordPress running. This has been an overview of creating an instance using the GUI. I hope it's been helpful. Thanks for watching. My name is Dwayne Potrods. Please contact us for more information or see some of our other videos.